happens when a moment of innocent father-daughter bonding turns into a life-changing confrontation. One woman's assumption sparks a chain of events that exposes the painful reality of racial prejudice and the powerful consequences of quick judgment. The park was alive with the sounds of children laughing and the scent of fresh grass hanging in the air. Families filled the space, some sitting on picnic blankets, others pushing their kids on swings or walking their dogs along the winding path. It was the kind of peaceful afternoon that made you forget about the rush of the outside world. Among them, a black father, in his late 40s, stood near the swing set, his eyes soft with affection as he gently pushed his 8-year-old daughter. Her bright giggles filled the air, as she swung higher and higher, her tiny hands gripping the ropes tightly. To the outside world, it seemed like a simple, happy scene, just another father spending quality time with his child. But not to Karen. A middle-aged woman with a short bob and a sharp gaze, she wandered through the park with a small dog tugging at her leash. As soon as she caught sight of the father and daughter, her expression changed, a slight furrow creasing her brow. Something about the situation didn't sit right with her. She couldn't put her finger on it, but a sense of unease began to grow. Her eyes darted over to the father, watching every movement with suspicion. Without hesitation, Karen pulled out her phone, her fingers shaking as she dialed 911, convinced something was wrong. She just couldn't figure out what yet. Meanwhile, the father remained unaware of the storm brewing just beyond the swings. Karen walked through the park, her small dog trotting beside her as she navigated the familiar walking path. She always felt a sense of ownership here. This park, in her mind, belonged to people like her. People who didn't look out of place. But as she passed the playground, something caught her eye, a black man with his daughter. He was pushing her on the swings, the little girl's laughter rising with the motion. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual, but Karen's gaze lingered. There was something about the scene that didn't sit right with her. A brief wave of discomfort washed over her. The park was busy, filled with families, but somehow this man, this father, felt out of place. She told herself it was probably nothing, but her instincts were telling her otherwise. She overheard a snippet of conversation between the father and daughter. He was speaking softly, asking her how her day had gone, what she wanted for lunch. Innocent enough, but the words struck Karen as odd. "Are you sure it's safe to go there?" the father asked. Karen's heart raced. She didn't understand the context, but her mind was already jumping to conclusions. Why would he ask her that? What kind of father speaks that way to his child? A thought crept in. Irrational, but undeniable. What if he wasn't her father? What if he was trying to kidnap her? With her heart pounding, she pulled out her phone and dialed 911. She needed to act quickly before things got worse. Karen's fingers shook as she dialed 911, her mind racing with thoughts that didn't quite make sense, but felt urgent in the moment. She spoke quickly, her voice tight with panic. "Yes, I'm at the park near Oak Street. There's a black man, with a little girl. I think he's acting suspicious. The way he's talking to her, I'm not sure they're even related." She paused, catching her breath, but only briefly. "I think he might be trying to kidnap her. You need to send someone right away." Her words tumbled out, distorted and full of assumptions, but Karen didn't hesitate. In her mind, the situation was clear. She was doing the right thing. The police will handle it. As the dispatcher confirmed the details, Karen's grip on her phone tightened, her confidence growing. She had done her part. The rest was up to the authorities. Meanwhile, the black father, feeling the weight of her stare, began to grow uneasy. His gaze flicked toward Karen, but she quickly looked away, her attention now focused on the phone in her hand. Something about her posture, the way she stood a little too still, made him feel uneasy. He couldn't quite place it, but he instinctively pulled his daughter a little closer to him, his protective instincts kicking in. As the minutes passed, Karen's behavior began to draw the attention of other park-goers. A few people exchanged curious glances, sensing a shift in the atmosphere. The peace of the afternoon was beginning to crack, replaced by a subtle tension that spread through the park. Whispers began to float around, but no one knew exactly what was happening. The calm was gone. The sharp sound of a police car's siren echoed through the park, drawing the attention of everyone nearby. The officer, a young man in his mid-20s, stepped out of the vehicle with a serious but professional demeanor. His eyes scanned the park for a moment before landing on the black father and daughter near the swings. He approached them cautiously, his hand resting on the radio clipped to his belt. "Good afternoon, sir," the officer said, his tone polite but firm. "Can I ask you a few questions?" He glanced at the little girl, then back at the father. "We've received a report of suspicious activity here, and I need to make sure everything is all right." The father, though confused and unsettled, remained composed. His calm voice spoke as he answered the officer's questions, explaining that he was simply spending time with his daughter, enjoying the day. "She's my daughter," he said gently, his eyes momentarily meeting the officer's. "We've been here for a while, just playing." Despite his calm, the tension in the air was thick. The officer, still holding a wary stance, seemed uncertain. He glanced at his radio, where Karen's voice could still be heard faintly, recounting her version of the story, which was at odds with the peaceful scene unfolding before him. The little girl, now sensing the discomfort, looked up at her father with wide eyes. "Why are the police here, Daddy?" she asked softly, her voice trembling. The father bent down and whispered, "It's okay, sweetie. We're just talking to the nice officer. Everything's fine." Meanwhile, Karen stood at a distance, watching with a smug expression, convinced that her call had been the right thing to do. The black father, sensing the officer's growing hesitation, remained calm but firm. "If it helps clear things up," he said, reaching into his jacket pocket, "I can show you my ID." He pulled out his wallet, revealing a badge that gleamed in the sunlight, alongside a driver's license and an official ID card. The officer's fingers trembled slightly as he took the ID, his eyes scanning it quickly. Then they widened. His gaze flickered from the ID back to the father's face. The name on the card was unmistakable: Judge Thomas Matthews. A moment of stunned silence hung between them as the officer processed the information. This wasn't just any man in the park. This was a respected judge, a public figure with years of service to the community. The officer's heart sank, a mix of guilt and disbelief flooding him. His mind raced, and he couldn't shake the weight of the mistake he was about to have to face. Without another word, he turned and walked over to Karen, still standing a few feet away, her arms crossed in self-assurance. "Ma'am," the officer began, his voice measured and calm, "I've just confirmed the man you reported is Judge Thomas Matthews. He's a well-respected figure in this community. There's no issue here." Karen's face drained of color as the realization hit. She opened her mouth to say something but faltered, her thoughts scrambling for an explanation that wouldn't make her look foolish. I didn't know, I thought." Her words caught in her throat, but it was too late. The truth had unfolded, and there was no way to undo the damage now. The officer stood tall, his expression stern as he turned back to Karen. "Ma'am," he said sharply, his voice now carrying the weight of authority, "your call was completely unjustified. You've made a serious accusation against an innocent man and caused unnecessary distress. I suggest you think long and hard about the consequences of making such claims." Karen's face flushed bright red, the harsh words sinking deep into her. She opened her mouth to protest but found no words that could justify what she had done. The officer's gaze lingered on her for a moment before he turned and walked back to Judge Matthews. The black father, now visibly shaken by the turn of events, took a deep breath and straightened up. Though he had kept his composure throughout the ordeal, his eyes betrayed the hurt he was feeling. The way he had been unjustly singled out, the assumptions made without a second thought, cut deeper than he could explain. He slowly looked at Karen, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "Don't ever speak to me or my daughter again," he said, his words clear and final. Karen stammered, her eyes wide with panic as she scrambled to respond, her voice trembling. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean." But her apology felt hollow, as if she were only trying to cover up her embarrassment. The father didn't respond. He didn't need to. The damage was done. As the officer left the scene, Karen stood frozen, her face a mixture of humiliation and regret. The park, once full of life, now felt cold and distant. She was alone with her shame, realizing too late the consequences of her actions. As the officer drove off, The black father and his daughter quietly returned to their spot by the swings. The little girl, still somewhat shaken, climbed back onto the seat, her eyes flicking nervously toward Karen, who was now standing off in the distance. The father gently pushed the swing, his hands moving with a careful calmness that masked the storm brewing inside him. He smiled reassuringly at his daughter, trying to keep the mood light, but his heart was heavy. As they continued their afternoon, the father couldn't help but reflect on what had just happened. He had seen it too many times, being judged solely by the color of his skin. Whether it was a small comment, a sideways glance, or as today, an unfounded accusation, the weight of suspicion was something he carried every day. He had worked hard to earn respect, to build a career as a judge, to be seen for his character, and not the stereotypes that others imposed upon him. And yet, in that park, he had been reduced to someone dangerous, someone who needed to be checked out. He swallowed hard, feeling the familiar sting of injustice. Meanwhile, Karen was left standing alone in the aftermath of her actions, the smirk gone from her face. She had learned a painful lesson, one that would follow her long after the day's events had ended. Her assumptions, her biases, had nearly ruined a family's peaceful afternoon. As she walked away, she was forced to confront the ugly truths about her own prejudices, the harm they caused, and how quickly they could destroy trust. The father and daughter left the park that afternoon, the sun beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows on the path ahead. Though they had continued their day, their peaceful moment had been marred by the sharp sting of injustice. The father's quiet strength had kept him composed, but the emotional toll of the experience lingered. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't lashed out in anger, but the hurt was undeniable. He had faced this kind of treatment too many times before, being reduced to a stereotype, assumed to be a threat simply because of his skin color. Karen's rash judgment had contrasted sharply with the father's calm dignity. In her attempt to protect the community, she had almost torn a family apart. Her assumptions had led to an unnecessary confrontation, all based on nothing more than bias. The officer's intervention had revealed the truth, but it didn't erase the emotional wounds that had been caused. The father and daughter had to live with the reminder of how quickly someone could be judged, and how little it took to destroy a peaceful moment. The truth had prevailed, but it didn't change the fact that those moments of distrust, suspicion, and hurt had been deeply felt. The experience served as a reminder that small actions, whether a call to the police or a silent judgment, could lead to profound consequences. And while the truth always finds its way to the surface, the damage done by prejudice often takes far longer to heal.